Hey friend, welcome. I'm so excited to have you here listening to another episode of the Pattern Design Circle podcast. Here we talk all about the ins and outs of designing knit and crochet patterns and running a business that makes it all possible. I'm Jessica, your host, knitting pattern designer, design mentor, and the friend in your ear. Can't wait to dive right in. The Pattern Design Circle podcast is sponsored by the Pattern Design Circle, a membership community for knit and crochet pattern designers that are feeling lost, lonely, or frustrated in their business. It connects you with a supportive community that's always eager to answer your questions and help you through the hard times. And there's loads of resources and activities specifically catered to business and designing. Sound like your jam? Check it out at snickerdoodleknits.com/design-circle. That's snickerdoodle, like the cookie, knits, knits.com/design-circle. All right, let's get into it. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Pattern Design Circle podcast. I'm so excited to be here in your ear again with a special guest. We have Joanna from Precision Tech Editing with us, and Jo is actually my tech editor and has been since 2020-ish. Do you remember when we started working together?
I think it's around then, yeah.
Yes, because I'd been designing for about a year. I had had a few of my designs tech edited like for free or for really small payment from very brand new tech editors. Several of my patterns hadn't ever seen a tech editor, and I wanted to actually get things right. That was also when didn't know anything about charts yet. So in this episode, we are going to talk about like the relationship between designer and tech editor and building a working relationship because it's not so easy. And I feel like I was probably a client who was a huge pain to work with in the beginning. So want to go ahead and talk through that and what it looked like on your end and on my end. So like I mentioned, I had worked with a few tech editors before. One in particular definitely just wasn't my vibe. It's really important as a designer to feel comfortable enough with your tech editor to ask questions, to feel confident that they know what they're talking about. And for me, I discovered it was really important that I had a space where it was safe to push back and where you then were able to tell me, all right, this is why this is important, or these are kind of our options, or different things like that. Because as a creative, when you share your work with somebody else, it is it is a vulnerable position to be in. And it's easy to feel like when you get feedback that it's not perfect, then that means you're not good enough as a designer and things like that, which, retrospectively is silly, especially when you're first learning something. You're not going to know it. But so I discovered you through somebody. I feel like I must have posted something on Ravelry that indicated I was looking for a tech editor or something. I didn't have a whole bunch of recommendations, but somebody had DM'd me based on something I had posted. And they're like, hey, I've worked with Joanna. Here's her information. I recommend her. And so I reached out to you, and
Right.
you sent some like examples of pieces you had edited, designers you'd edited for, and it was honestly, it was 100% seeing some of the bigger name designers that I recognized on that list that made me feel really confident that you knew what you were doing. Do you
Right. Yeah.
remember when I reached out to you at all?
Yeah. So, like, as you said, like, it's so important for the designer and the tech editor to be able to work well together. And not every tech editor will be good for every designer. Like, I like to think of myself as a good tech editor, but there are some designers out there who our personalities and our ways of working just don't mesh. And
Yes.
so any designer should make sure that they're comfortable with the tech editor they have and that they like the way the feedback goes. Um,
Mhm.
and yeah, like I'm very lucky in that I got to do some editing for some big names fairly early on in my career. And that was really because, like, when I started tech editing, I guess about 7 years ago now. Before that, I'd been an engineer doing lab work. And I decided I wanted to do something different, and I had no idea what. And one day I was talking to someone at the Toronto Knitters Guild, who's Kate Atherley, who is a designer and a tech editor for Knitty. Um, and she said, "I bet you'd be good at this. Have you ever tried it?" And I didn't even realize it was something that people did at that point. But she said she thought I would be good at it, and so she sent me one of her patterns to edit and said, "Try it and see if you like it, and let's see if you're any good." And she was impressed, and I enjoyed it. And so that first pattern was like a baby bonnet. It was pretty simple. The second pattern she sent me was her motorcycle jacket, which is like in like a huge range of sizes and not a normal construction. And like, so talk about throwing someone in the deep end. So I really sort of muscled my way through that, learned a lot doing it. But ever since then, I've been editing her individual release patterns. And because she's also a tech editor, she would sometimes pass people on to me when she was too busy to do the work herself. And that's really how I got access to those big names. Like, I owe it all to Kate.
Yeah. So when you have like a new to you designer reach out to you and you start talking, at what point are you able to kind of fill out whether it feels like it's going to be a good relationship, or are there certain things that you do that you feel like help make the relationship easier, go more smoothly?
Yeah. So I guess it it's really hard to tell until after you've done the first pattern how
Mm.
well people are going to work together. I guess from my perspective, the things that I try to do is I try to make sure that I'm not writing over the designer's voice. So if I'm trying to correct something, I will either, if it's something very simple like the numbers wrong, then I'll just edit it with track changes. But if it's the way something's worded, then I will suggest that it needs to be something like this, and then hope that the designer will reword that into something that sounds like their voice. Because it's their pattern. It should sound like it was written by them, not by me. And I'm a very logical engineering type person, so my writing is very different from a lot of designers' writing. So I shouldn't be sort of writing that text. The designer should. So I guess with a lot of designers that works well and they're happy. I've had a few people where they were frustrated because they're like, if it should be changed, change it to what it should be.
Mm.
And so those are people who are better off with a different tech editor than me.
Yeah, and that's probably why it like our relationship works so well for me, because I do like to have a bit of autonomy. I like to have control over my projects and to feel like it's mine. And so I think your approach of recommending things gave me the space then to push back. So when our first working together, was it 4 patterns that kind of we'd agreed to for a certain price, which was definitely not a price that was paying you 100% for your time. Um, but the way that you had described it to me at the time was like, all right, this will help us to kind of work through some of the the differences. And, you know, it helped, it really did help build confidence in me. I think it really helped to have to know, all right, we're working through 4 patterns together. And I think that maybe that time period, even if it had only been one, uh, I don't know if I would have worked as hard to work through that. But having the 4 um, was, I think, a super valuable point to start at. And uh, after that, I was definitely a big fan of working with you, and it definitely worked from a business perspective. But yeah, I guess like I was still fairly new to knitting in general. And there were a lot of things that were standard in the industry that really annoyed me. So like to be fully transparent, the designers listening in, uh, there were moments I was really irritated and I was really frustrated. And I was like, I hate how these patterns are written in the industry. Normally, I want to make them easier for knitters to work and people like me. And looking back now, I'm kind of proud of how I did push back and uh, you know, didn't just accept face value. This is kind of the way it maybe would sound better, but I kind of stood up for myself and was like, hey, I really don't like this. And then that allowed you the space to explain a lot of things. And I think that was so valuable for myself as a designer to really understand, okay, this is why things are written this way. This is why this is a lot clearer because the way that I had written it could have been interpreted as four different things, but then rewording it to certain places uh, could help a lot. What was that experience for you like with those, especially those initial patterns when I was very kind of opinionated and vocal about my opinions?
Yeah, no, it was fun. I really enjoy when I'm working with somebody who does have opinions and pushes back, because sometimes just because things have always been done that way doesn't mean that it's the best way to do it. And so
Mhm.
sometimes people like you come up with better ideas of how to explain something or how to show something in a chart or whatever. Um, and so I actually really enjoyed it. And like as you say, you were fairly new when you started working with me, and I saw a huge change in your writing between those first couple of patterns and then the next pattern you sent me after that first batch. And
Mhm.
so you took everything that I suggested and told you and things that we incorporated into those patterns, and you just picked it up really quickly and started using that stuff. And so yeah, I found you really easy to work with, and like yeah, it's kind of boring if somebody doesn't push back and you just make some changes and they say, okay, great, I'll use your numbers, and then you never hear from them again. Like, I mean, it's more fun for me if there's some back and forth and some discussion about stuff, and the way everybody learns and improves. So
Yeah, yeah, and it definitely built, I feel like more of a relationship between us rather than it just being a transaction back and forth of a design or
yeah,
a pattern, but actually more of a discussion and just preferences and logically talking through the way that our brains work and all of the different things that went into it. And then because of everything that went into it, I think it gave me a lot more confidence in my patterns too, to be able to say, okay, this is something that I really love, that I like, I think this makes a lot of sense to a newer knitter. I think, it's a lot better patterns than a lot of the patterns I had worked through. And I know that I feel very confident in the technicality in that and knowing that now, okay, there are things that are more clear than I would have written them initially, but it was still something that I felt really proud of as my own creative work too. Um, and so then once we've really ironed through a lot of that stuff, we're very much more on the same page now. There,
yeah, yeah,
it's
absolutely.
not nearly as much communication back and forth and me arguing about the way things are written and things like that. But uh, yeah, I think your approach in the beginning was actually, at least for my style, very, very helpful to actually build a lasting tech editing relationship that I could feel safe in, and not feel embarrassed for making mistakes. Uh, and yeah, I think, because my background is engineering as well, it was just the education. I never actually worked in the engineering field. But I think I, still had a little bit of, well, I know how to do math. Like, and so if a math piece came back wrong, like, it was kind of crushing. Like, how did I miss that? But to just really feel safe in a relationship where, like, it's okay to make mistakes. We're human. Somebody else is here to help catch those. I do know I got a lot more lax in like the way that I pre-edited my patterns, sending them to you because like, well, I know Joanna will catch it. Which I think, is pros and cons. It saved me a lot of time and a lot of stress trying to make sure everything was perfect before I sent it. It does mean that it added more to your plate, but I think we got to a point where, you know, it's even those mistakes, it doesn't feel super significant.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think we've gotten to a point where we just work really well together. It's like you know what to expect from me, and I know what I'm expecting from you. Um, and like I have a bunch of different types of people who are my customers, and so I have some people who I find editing their work more difficult just because the way they think and write is very different from me. And then there are people whose patterns I find really easy. And so if I'm getting frustrated by one of the ones that I find harder, I will take somebody like you whose patterns I'm used to and I find easy and work on one of those instead, just to give me a
Mhm.
break. And then I can go back and focus on the one that I'm finding harder to work through because we just, yeah, I think as you say, like we're both engineers, and so the way we think about things I think is a little bit similar. And sometimes when I have somebody who's very creative and artistic and doesn't have much of a math background, it can sometimes be a lot more challenging to find common ground sometimes.
Yes, yes. And then, I have stepped back from designing as much the last couple of years, and now you don't have my patterns as much. But and then I guess I did design a couple of garments that you saw would have been like a year and a half ago now. Um I'm kind of because that was my first time designing garments. I had only knit one baby garment and one adult garment before that, and they were both raglans, and what I was designing was yokes. So from your perspective, how was that? Because designing a garment for the first time is another big step as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, like it wasn't like it made sense that everything you were doing, like you were looking at other people's patterns and things out there. And so your numbers mostly made sense. And so it like I mean there were places where I could maybe suggest things that should be changed a little bit. But it's like I feel like you did most of the heavy lifting and hard work on that rather than me. But it's really it's challenging for anyone to do a garment that's in a bunch of sizes and get the sizing right. And so yeah, that's something that even more experienced designers struggle with and spend longer on trying to make sure that it'll fit a, a nice wide range of sizes properly and look good on their bodies.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, but yeah, I think you in a way, yolks are more forgiving than some other designs. And so it was probably a good choice for your first one rather than Reglan or something like that.
There's a reason I started
Yeah.
there. Yes. I do remember, I think especially after the second one, I was I don't remember what it was that I had messed up at this point. It was something in my spreadsheets that then I wasn't tracking super well. And so then when there was an error, it was really frustrating to go back through it and try to fix it all. It would have been the gently flowing pullover, so it was probably something to do with those short rows that I was creating with the curve in the body.
Right.
Um, and I was like so over grading a garment. I just want to hire somebody else to do this for me. But we made it through. Also, I guess going back to when I first hired you as well, you taught me how, I kind of alluded to this, but you taught me how to do charts and everything. Which was, I mean, it's kind of like teaching a new language on a small scale. Actually,
Yeah.
what direction do things go on a chart? And do you remember anything specifically from charts or your experience maybe helping other designers with charts?
So, um, like from you, what I remember is when you first started, you were very adamant that you wanted to have written instructions and you wanted to have charted instructions for everything.
Mhm.
And when you wanted to make a chart for like knit one, purl one ribbing or knit two, purl two ribbing, I was like, why do we need a chart for this? You know? So I found that a little bit weird because I've never worked with somebody who was so adamant that if we're charting absolutely everything. I'm like, you don't need a chart, it's so simple. but um but yeah, you picked up charting really quickly. There so a lot of designers use Stitch Mastery, which is a great program for charts, but it's not free. And so there are lots of designers who can't afford or don't want to pay for it. And so I've I sometimes get patterns where people have made their own charts in Excel and like picked their own symbols to represent things. And I find those challenging both for me to read through and check and compare to the written instructions. And then also I worry about how the knitter is going to deal with that because there is a standard set of symbols that everyone more or less uses, like there are dots versus dashes, like those sorts of things, but you don't ever see like pluses in a normal chart. And so when you have somebody who's using pluses and I don't know, quotation marks or things to represent different stitches, it yeah, so it's sometimes try to convince them to maybe have somebody who has knitting software like Stitch Mastery make it up for them so that it's easier for the knitter to read because it's formatted the way they're used to.
Hmm.
Um, I love making charts. It's one of my favorite things to do. Whenever somebody lets me, I will make their chart for them.
I would guess that there's probably a number of designers who are happy to let you make the charts. Do you feel that it's easier to like uh so if somebody's learning okay, let's say somebody learned first how to read charts and is learning how to read written instructions, and then somebody else learned how to read written instructions first, like I did, and now is learning how to read charts. Do you feel like one direction is more difficult to learn than the other?
I would say probably going from charts to written instructions is harder than going from written instructions to charts because written instructions tend to have more information provided. So if you understand how that works, then once you understand what the various symbols in a chart represent and how to read it, whether it's always from the right on if you're going in the round or from either side if you're working flat, then I think people who are already used to reading instructions can look at that and translate it quickly. But if you just learned how to use charts and so all you know is okay, my chart's 20 stitches, I've got 20 stitches on my needle, so I do that. And then for all of the other stuff, like if there's any shaping or things like that that aren't in the chart, then I think that will be harder for someone to pick up if they've only ever worked from charts versus written instructions. Like there's just some stuff that's really hard to chart, some things you just have to describe.
Yes. And we were working entirely via email, back and forth communicating. Uh, Do you find it difficult to teach people how to read charts or to explain written instructions when it is on email?
It, I'd say 85, 90% of the time, no.
Mhm.
Most of the time, I feel like I can usually come up with a way of describing things that will make sense to the other person. But sometimes there are some people where it's just easier to try to have a Zoom meeting and chat with each other because it's like it's going back and forth where I'll send something and they don't understand what I'm saying and they'll just write back saying I don't understand. And then like if you keep on doing that, then it can take days to get somewhere. Especially because I'm often in a very different time zone from most of the people I'm working with. Um, but so there are some people where it can be hard just with written instructions and talking clarifies things. But I find most people email works most of the time.
Mhm. Lovely. So the last few years you've done some editing for magazines. You edited for us on In Tandem, but I know you also work for another company. Uh, how has or how does the designer editor relationship differ? Maybe in a more typical magazine publication setup compared to the indie designer who's just talking to you.
Sure, yeah. It's it definitely adds an extra layer of complexity to things um, because if if a customer has just come to me and we've decided to work together, then I'm their one and only means of communication. And so everything is going between just the two of us. With something like a magazine, you've got somebody who is sort of introducing you to the designer and who is making decisions at the magazine or at the yarn company or wherever. And so sometimes if the designer doesn't like what I'm saying, they'll try to go to the other person and try to like basically go over my head. And um, sometimes that works, but most of the time it doesn't because I'm trying to work from the style sheet and the way that I've been told by the magazine or the yarn company that their patterns need to be formatted and how they're supposed to look and be written and those sorts of things. And so I'm just trying to turn the pattern into the style and and voice that they want for that. And I guess working with In Tandem was interesting just because I found some of the designers were super proactive and responded right away. Other designers I found it was really hard to actually get a response from them. And so that was a little bit frustrating. Like if that was a an indie client of mine, if that kept going, I would just say, look, I don't think we should work together anymore. But
Mhm.
you can't do that when you're doing this on behalf of somebody else and you've agreed to do the whole thing for that person. So
Yes, yes, and it has to be like cohesive with the rest of the issue and everything. Yeah, I definitely um noticed some also of what you had said of you know, designers trying to felt like persuade either you or me to change our minds.
yeah,
Um, and that wasn't just me on the admin team either, but um yeah, and I mean it's more complex because now it's kind of like you're working with two style guides. Like there's the magazine style guide, but then especially for In Tandem where it was meant to be more of a designer led, not a typical publication
yeah,
style, where then, all right, how do we have designer preference and voice and still have this whole cohesive style guide and standard and voice that needs to show up throughout all of the patterns that maybe kind of creates a conflicting dynamic there in trying to figure out how the pattern should actually be written.
Yeah, it definitely added a level of challenge. Like the other collections that I work on, there is just a style guide and you have to conform to it. And so because the designers had a say in this, it was sometimes harder to come to a consensus because it had to be consensus between myself, the designer, and you, the people organizing the magazine, not just any two of us. And getting three people to agree on things is always harder than two.
Yes, yes. Um, in general, do you have a preference towards working like with indie designers or publications, just that you prefer?
I really like having a mix because with the standard publication sort of thing, it's nice to know that I will have that steady, regular work each time there's an issue or a collection coming out. And it's nice that I know and understand the style guide, and so it's at this point I've been doing it for long enough for people that I barely have to look back at the style guide when I'm editing. I just know what it should be like, and so that's really nice. But I think I get the most satisfaction out of helping independent designers, especially newer ones, get their patterns to a point where they're in good shape and they're easy to read and knitters will like them. Because I know a lot of designers when they're starting out, like they're not going to make much, if anything, off of the patterns that they write at the very beginning. And so because of that, I've always tried to keep my fees low and offer deals sort of like I did with you for your first four patterns, because even if they don't keep using me, I'm hoping that I'll be able to teach them some of the things that are important when I work with them on that first pattern that they'll be able to use in the future. And I get a lot of satisfaction about helping designers write patterns that are good.
Mhm. Yeah. So what's your mix of designers that you are working with now as far as more experienced designers and less experienced designers?
So I guess I'd say I work more with newer designers than experienced ones. Um, there are only a couple experienced ones who I'm their regular tech editor for. I'm often the backup person if Kate's not around,
Mm.
basically.
Yes.
Um, but so it's people who either are new or were new when I started working with them, but at this point they've been doing it for a number of years, like yourself, and so they're a little more established. Um, but yeah, it's nice. I have a variety of people. I have people in the States. I have people in Europe. I have people sort of Australia, New Zealand. So it's kind of fun just being able to work with people from all over.
Yes, yes. Is there anything in particular that you feel like designers could benefit knowing from the tech editor, like knowing about tech editing or from the tech editor perspective of maybe what your challenges are as a tech editor working with a pattern that would help designers be more understanding or more receptive or something?
Yeah, I guess. So I guess one of the things is a lot of so there's tech editing and there's test knitting. Those are two different things. There are a lot of people who feel like I can do one or the other. I don't need to do both. Um, and so whenever I come up with to someone who has decided that they're just going to do test knits, like I worry about that because first of all, you may not be having somebody test knit each of your sizes. And second of all, depending on how experienced your test knitters are, they will read a bad pattern and just infer what it's supposed to say and not really notice that there are things missing and comment on it. And so I feel like you need a tech editor to make sure that not only the numbers are right, but the instructions are clear and make sense and are fully written, they're not ambiguous, can't be interpreted different ways by different people, that kind of thing. And I feel like that often doesn't get picked up by test knitters,
Mm.
because the people who volunteer to test knit often are experienced knitters, and they just see right through things, and they don't comment on it, and so it doesn't actually help you get a better written pattern.
Mhm.
Um,
And
so
sometimes
yeah, like, sorry, go ahead.
sometimes testers, like with stitch count numbers or whatever, like they're not paying attention and then they're like, oh, something didn't work out, but I don't know if it was my problem or your problem. Or maybe they just assume it's their problem and they don't say anything. And yes, there's so much of that definitely
Yeah,
happens.
yeah, exactly. And so like I feel like ideally you should have both, uh, somebody tech edit it and a few people test knit it, because a tech editor is not making the item, so they're just reading through it and seeing if it makes logical sense in their brain. And so sometimes there are things that a tech editor will miss because reading it on paper is like, oh yeah, that sounds like it makes sense. But it's not until somebody's trying to do it with the needles, they're like, wait, how can I do that? That's on the wrong side, or, and so it's, I really feel like you ought to have both to get a fully tested pattern that will be the clearest and the most correct for your customers.
Yes, yes. And I think fit stuff is easier to identify on the testing side once somebody's trying to put a garment on their actual body. Uh, I think tech editing is really important to do first so that your numbers and all of the instructions are the best they can be so that
Yeah,
you don't end up with a bunch of issues in testing, but the testing really confirms like, hey, the people that are going to make this thing, it's going to actually look like what I want it to look like, what my sample looks like. And so
yeah,
I agree that's
exactly.
cool. Yes. Um, what's your favorite thing about test or tech editing?
Sorry, say that again.
What is your favorite thing about tech editing? Why do you love tech editing?
Um, I guess so. I'm a geek. I love working with spreadsheets, and so having my spreadsheets where I throw all the numbers in and check things. And as I mentioned before, making charts. I love making charts, and I just um. So like in terms of the actual work, I think those are the two things. But most of all, it's just I really enjoy working with a wide range of people and being able to do something related to knitting that helps other people and gets me a little bit of income. And yeah, so I just, the whole thing is a lot of fun. I'm really glad I started doing this, and can't imagine doing anything else now.
Yes. Um, and then is there anything you feel like would be helpful for a new designer who maybe is feeling scared about having their work edited and gone through in a fine-tooth comb, or just maybe unsure of what to expect from tech editing? Anything that you think would be helpful for them to hear?
Yeah, so I think the most important thing is that a tech editor, their job is to help you, to make sure that your pattern is as correct and as understandable as it possibly can be. They're not there to grade you or critique you or or overwrite you and write things in their style when you've got things written in your own. They should, a good tech editor at least, should be just checking the math and then making suggestions on how to word things when it's not clear or there's like some explanations missing or something, that they'll help you with that. But like, their job isn't to say your pattern sucks, and they would never do that. Their job is to take your pattern, which is a great pattern, and you've written it as well as you can as a new designer, but there are things that you just may not know yet, in terms of like, there's a standard way that people tend to word things if you're doing a sock. And so if you're a newer knitter, you might use slightly different wordings that would confuse people who are used to seeing a standard sock pattern. And so a tech editor can help you make sure you're using the terminology and that sort of thing. But yeah, so I wouldn't be scared. I would make sure you find a tech editor who you think you'll work well with, and if you are in a place where you don't feel like you can afford to pay much, then come to an agreement up front that there's a cap, and basically try to get somebody to help you with your pattern, but not to the point that you're going into debt, because I know that as a new designer, you're going to have a hard time selling that pattern enough to make that money back.
Mm.
Um, but it's still an important thing to do. And even if you don't wind up using a tech editor every single time on every single pattern, working with them once or once in a while when you try a new thing, like the first time you're doing garments, say, like having somebody go through it will help you. Um, so yeah, that would be my advice.
Yeah, yeah, and that help not only helps that pattern, but it helps all of your future patterns as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
Um, I would say that I would add that also just in general, any relationship, any collaboration, communication is so valuable and helpful. So, um, I have a few friends who do some tech editing themselves. So I hear a little bit of their woes as a tech editor as well. And just things as simple as giving your tech editor a heads up, like, hey, I'm working on this pattern. Are you going to have availability to edit this? Can I get on your calendar? That kind of communication beforehand. And then, of course, communicating through the process and asking for clarification, asking for assistance where you need it, telling them if you disagree with something and figure out what's actually the part that you disagree about. And
Right.
uh, then if if you're not able to respond for a while, like, you said like some designers, like if they were to just not keep responding, then well, is this relationship ended then? Yeah,
Yeah.
just responding if you're not going to be able to get to response for a while or things like that. I know that some of my tech editor friends, it just drives them up the wall when they they just quit hearing from a designer and don't know what's going on. So I think communication is something that is really valuable on both ends.
Yeah.
But on the design,
Absolutely. Yeah. And just something about what you said there, like for designers who are going to be working with tech editors have other customers and often have things in their queue. So it's not uncommon for me to get a new designer contact me and say, can you edit my pattern? I need it by the end of this week. And unfortunately, my answer is going to be no. I have clients who have sent me their stuff already, and their stuff needs to be done first. Um, so yeah, like don't wait till the last minute. Um, Try to plan in advance, and if you can, send them a heads up and say, I'm working on this. I expect it to be ready in 2 weeks. Could you save some time for me? Then I can plan for that. But if you just show up at the last minute saying, I need this by tomorrow because I want to send it to, I don't know, some submission or other and want to make sure it's okay, then you're unlikely to find somebody who can help you.
Mhm.
So yeah, just be mindful that tech editors can often turn things around relatively quickly, but don't guarantee, like that's not guaranteed. They may be on vacation or they may have a bunch of things in their queues. So make sure you check what their workload is like before you just assume that you can get something back that week.
Yes, yes. And that kind of reminded me, like, you can also sometimes work out something with your tech editor where, all right, I have this piece ready if you have time in whenever you have time to work through that, and then I'll keep editing or I'll keep writing the rest of the pattern. We did that on one of my garments. Um, that
Yeah.
was like, all right, I know timeline wise this needs to be in testing at this point, but I'm still rubbing back and reworking this part of the garment. So we were able to get the beginning part tech edited to get to testing while I finished the rest of the pattern. Um,
Yeah.
just coordinating, knowing what the timeline actually needs to look like. Helpful. So, Joanna, do you have openings in for new clients right now? Are you
Yeah.
accepting?
I am accepting new clients all the time. So would be happy to work with anybody who's looking for a tech editor. Um, my right now my queue is fairly large, so it's probably a couple of weeks before I'd be able to look at anybody who contacts me right now. But often things are a little bit slower, and I can get things done within a week or so. Um, so yeah, I'd be very happy to have any of the people listening to this podcast who need a tech editor to contact me.
Perfect. Yes, and I'll put your website in the description of this
Awesome, thank you.
episode. Yes, and I recommend Joanna to anybody who's looking for an editor. I do know, um, like we talked about earlier, everyone has a different personality. So just because I highly recommend Joanna. You know, don't feel, well, and I like to be upfront and honest about the beginning of our relationship too, where it was like it wasn't just smooth sailing. It wasn't just like, all right, like it's all perfect. But to expect it to be normal, to work through just figuring out what does this relationship look like? What are our personality differences? What are our styles for actually understanding and discussing things? And whomever you're working with, that's probably going to be the case. And if you work on a pattern or two or three and you're just like, this isn't working, that's fine. Like, there's more editors.
Absolutely. I do not take it personally when somebody decides to move on to a different tech editor. I just assume that for one reason or another, I wasn't a good fit for them, and that's okay. Not everyone will be.
Mhm. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us and sharing a bit about.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Yes, yes, it's been lovely. Wow, thanks so much for listening to this episode. If you found it valuable, please share the podcast with a designer friend. And if you have a minute, leave a review. It's so helpful for me and means the world to me. Chat soon.